The king's gaze turned icy, and he stared at each of the warriors in turn. "My only son was out there, and none of you stood by him? There is a traitor among us. I can feel it." Before the warriors could respond, Ola, DikA's betrothed, stormed over to them, her face twisted with anger. One by one, she slapped each warrior across the face. "You fools," she spat. "The prince is missing, and yet here you all stand. Why didn't you fight to the death for him? You should have died out there instead of coming back with your pathetic excuses." The villagers gasped, shocked at Ola's harsh words. Once upon a time, in the peaceful village of Mello, lived a young warrior prince named DikA. He was strong, handsome, and adored by everyone in the kingdom. The people eagerly awaited the day he would become king, certain that his rule would be kinder and more just than that of his father. He had already begun making changes as a prince, proving he would be a ruler who cared deeply for his people. DikA's father, the king, had betrothed him to a beautiful maiden named Ola. She wore the finest beads, always dressing in her best to impress him whenever she visited the palace. But despite her beauty and constant presence, DikA had no interest in her. He had argued with his father, insisting, "I want to choose my own bride. I don't want a life decided for me." But the king was firm. "A prince must marry, and it is tradition for the prince to wed before the old king passes," he replied, convinced that DikA would never settle down on his own. He feared that if left to his son's high standards, DikA might never marry at all. Ola was not about to give up. She visited the palace often, pretending to fulfill her duties as the future princess, even though it was clear to everyone that DikA barely noticed her. After yet another day of rejection, Ola returned home and spoke bitterly to her father. "I don't care if he doesn't like me," she snapped. "All that matters is I will be his bride. With the king alive, he has no choice. He must marry me." Her father nodded approvingly. "Patience, my daughter. A man like DikA may take time to sway, but persistence pays off." A sly smile crossed Ola's face as a plan began to form in her mind. She wouldn't need DikA's love if she could secure his commitment by force. DikA was too busy for thoughts of love. His days were filled with the duties of the palace, protecting the village, and planning defenses against approaching enemies. Ola, however, used this time to spread rumors of her rightful place as future queen, boasting of her rule to come. Her arrogance began to fill the peaceful village with whispers of unease and tension. Then, one day, the threat of war became very real. The kingdom's enemies approached, and the prince knew he would have to lead the people of Mello into battle. Villagers locked their doors, whispering prayers for their warriors and their prince. DikA prepared his troops, his face resolute as he addressed them. "Today, we fight to protect our homes, our families, and our freedom. Stand strong, and we shall prevail." The battle was fierce. The prince fought at the center of his warriors, urging them on with courage and strength. The warriors of Mello fought with every ounce of strength they had. Hours passed, and finally, as dusk settled, the invaders were driven back. But when the warriors gathered to celebrate their victory, they looked around and realized their prince was nowhere to be found. The warriors of Mello trudged back to the village with heavy hearts. Worry lined their faces as they realized they'd have to return without Prince DikA. How could they claim victory when their prince was missing? Reluctantly, they made their way back, carrying the weight of the news. As they arrived, the villagers gathered eagerly, expecting the usual shouts of triumph and joy. But this time, there was only silence. The warriors' faces were somber, their heads lowered. The king's face fell, sensing that something was wrong. "Where is my son?" he demanded, his voice tight with fear. As his eyes swept over the group, he suddenly noticed that DikA was missing. His face went pale, and he clutched his chest, struggling to keep his composure. "Tell me," he commanded, his voice trembling with anger. "Where is my son?" The warriors, fearful for their lives, explained how they had lost sight of Prince DikA in the chaos of battle. "He fought bravely, Your Majesty," one of them said, "stronger than any of us. But we couldn't find him after the battle ended." The king's gaze turned icy, and he stared at each of the warriors in turn. "My only son was out there, and none of you stood by him? There is a traitor among us. I can feel it." Before the warriors could respond, Ola, DikA's betrothed, stormed over to them, her face twisted with anger. One by one, she slapped each warrior across the face. "You fools," she spat. "The prince is missing, and yet here you all stand. Why didn't you fight to the death for him? You should have died out there instead of coming back with your pathetic excuses." The villagers gasped, shocked at Ola's harsh words. They were already grieving, but Ola's outburst turned their sorrow to anger. How could she speak like this, with so little heart? That evening, the village sat quietly in their huts, whispering about the day's events and speculating about what could have happened to their prince. Weeks soon turned into months, and still, there was no sign of the prince. The people mourned in silence, watching as the bright future they had once imagined with DikA on the throne seemed to slip away. Meanwhile, Ola grew more impatient with each passing day. One evening, she sat with her father, her tone sharp. "What now, father? The prince is gone, and my chance at royalty is slipping away. What will happen to us?" Her father gave her a cunning smile. "Don't worry, my daughter. Now that the prince is gone, the king will have to choose a new successor. And he won't choose just anyone. He'll need someone strong, someone the people trust. And who better than DikA's most trusted advisor, a femme?" Ola's eyes lit up, a wicked smile spreading across her face. "A femme," she whispered, delighted. A femme, the man she had secretly longed for, was now her ticket to the throne. She laughed softly, lying back on her bed, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "Well, Prince DikA," she murmured under her breath, "let's see how you rule from the grave. You rejected me, but now you'll watch as I take everything that was meant for you. No one will ever suspect me, not after the drama I've stirred up." The king was restless, his heart weighed down by his son's disappearance. He sought out soothsayers and wise men, hoping for news of DikA's fate, but no answer came. Desperation filled his days as he waited for the son who seemed lost forever. After Prince DikA's disappearance, the palace felt strangely quiet. Ola was no longer seen strolling around as she usually did. But a week after he vanished, she began to reappear, strutting through the village with her usual arrogance, yet now adding fear to the hearts of the people. The villagers wondered who she could possibly be planning to marry now that Prince DikA was gone. How could she still act so boldly? The king withdrew into solitude. Months passed, stretching into a full year, with no word of his son. Then, one night, just as the king sat alone in his chambers, a young maiden arrived at the palace gates, requesting a private meeting. Though it was late, The king could not sleep and decided to speak with her. The guards showed the maiden in, and she approached the king with respect, her eyes filled with quiet courage. "My king," she began, bowing low, "forgive my boldness and my lateness. My name is Dina. I am but a slave girl." The king nodded, gesturing for her to continue, though he was curious what a slave girl could possibly have to say. Sensing his attention, Dina continued, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "Your son sent me to speak with you," she said. "He wanted me to tell you that he is alive and will return soon as he has regained his strength." The king let out a long relieved breath, sinking back into his chair, his eyes glistening with grateful tears. "Tell me everything," he whispered. Dina nodded, gathering her courage. "Months ago, I saw something on the bank of the stream, and when I went closer, I realized it was a young man, barely alive. I live nearby, so I took him to my home, cared for him as best I could. I didn't know he was your son. I am a slave and live far from the village. I hadn't heard that the prince was missing. My only wish was to see him open his eyes." The king listened carefully, nodding. "You did well, Dina. His safety is all that matters to me." Dina continued, "The prince is recovering, but his body is still weak. I'm not sure what happened in the battle, my king, he has shared little." The king frowned in thought but nodded, grateful for the news. The next morning, he summoned Ola to the palace. When she arrived, she wore a smug look, but the king was blunt. "Ola," he called, "my son is missing, yet you show little grief. Why?" Ola crossed her arms, her expression cold. "My king, I wanted to be royalty, not to be with DikA. If he is truly gone, then perhaps the gods are sparing me from a life he never wanted with me." The king's face darkened, and with a curt nod, he dismissed her. With the village pressuring him to name a successor, the king announced a gathering, hoping that word would somehow reach DikA. On the day of the gathering, the villagers whispered, expecting to see a femme, DikA's most trusted advisor. Ola hovered possessively by a femme's side, shooting cold looks at any woman who dared glance his way. The people murmured, pitying their prince, whose would-be bride cared only for power. Just as the king stood to speak, he paused, gazing into the distance. The crowd turned to see what had caught his attention. There, emerging from the horizon, was a lone figure walking toward them. Gasps and shouts filled the air as people recognized him. "It's DikA," they cried, rushing forward to greet him, falling at his feet, thanking the gods for his safe return. DikA embraced them warmly, reassuring everyone with words of strength and encouragement. Seeing their genuine relief and happiness touched him deeply, but his eyes soon settled on his father. He approached his father, bowing his head. "Father," he said, his voice filled with quiet emotion, "I am here." The king, overcome with emotion, reached out to hold his son's shoulders, as if assuring himself that DikA was truly before him. Then, in a sudden turn, DikA faced Ola, a femme, and the king's advisor, all of whom stood off to the side, looking down in shame. "Father," DikA said firmly, his voice echoing through the silent crowd, "these three must be punished." He pointed to a femme, and Ola. "A femme betrayed me on the battlefield, covering my face with a dark powder laced with magic, intending to leave me for dead. It was only through fate that I survived. And he did this," DikA continued, "with the help of your own advisor, and his daughter, Ola, who wanted the throne at any cost." The crowd gasped, and cries of anger and betrayal rose up. Ola fell to her knees, her face pale. "Please, my king, forgive me," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I only wanted to be royalty. I was foolish, but my father made me believe it was the only way." The king, with a cold, stern gaze, looked at the three of them, his heart heavy with betrayal. He gave a final nod, signaling their fate, as the crowd murmured with shock and relief, knowing justice would be served. The people of Melo were so overwhelmed with joy at seeing their prince alive that it didn't even cross their minds to ask how he had been saved. But as they looked at him more closely, they noticed a thin, unique red thread tied around his wrist. Curious whispers spread through the crowd. Had he married in secret? Or was there a woman he'd met who had captured his heart? Their questions lingered, but for now, they were just relieved to see him safe. That evening, the king sat alone with his son, glancing at the red thread on the prince's wrist. He raised an eyebrow, hoping his son would explain. DikA grinned, reading his father's curiosity. "I like her," he said simply. The king's gaze softened, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. He already had an idea of whom his son was speaking about, the slave girl, Dina, who had nursed him back to health. "She's a slave, DikA. Are you sure?" the king asked gently, though there was no judgment in his tone. DikA's face lit up. "Father, she's more than that. She has wisdom, strength, and a heart full of kindness. You taught me that true character shines brighter than any title, and Dina's compassion and courage saved my life. In just 1 week under her care, I knew she was the one. She completes me." The king looked at him thoughtfully. "And is that why you couldn't wait until after marriage?" he asked, a hint of disappointment in his voice. But DikA's smile softened. "I respect our traditions. I feared the god's anger, so I asked her to tie this red thread around my wrist as a promise to one day marry me, if you approved. I am still a prince, but I want her beside me." The king nodded, understanding and slowly breaking into a warm smile. "If she's the one you love, then that's enough for me. I only wanted to see you married and happy, my son." DikA's face, however, grew more serious. "But there's one problem. When I told her I was the prince, she grew distant. She's afraid of the trouble it might bring, and your anger." The king chuckled, catching his son by surprise. "I don't care about her status. All I care about is seeing you happy. Your return is worth more than any royal arrangement." DikA's heart swelled with gratitude as he looked at his father, realizing his love and understanding went beyond that tradition. After the kingdom returned to peace, DikA could hardly wait to see Dina, the woman who had risked everything to save his life. He found himself restless, his heart racing as he left the palace and made his way to her small home, determined to see her face and hear her voice. The sun was setting when he arrived, casting a warm glow over the village. Outside her house, Dina stood, gazing into the distance, her expression both hopeful and sad. The moment she saw him, her face lit up, though there was a hint of worry in her eyes. DikA approached with a soft smile and sat down beside her, gently pulling her close. "Did you miss me already?" he teased, wrapping his arm around her. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting too long. There was so much to take care of at the palace." Dina smiled but hesitated, then rested her head against his chest. Her heart was beating quickly. She knew this could be the last time she saw him. "I'm just glad you're here," she whispered, but there was sadness in her voice. DikA could sense her hesitation. He held her a little tighter and said, "Dina, you belong here in my heart." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I want you to know I never accepted Ola as my bride. The only reason she turned against me was because I refused to be with her. But I want you, Dina. You are the one I've chosen." Dina looked up, worry shadowing her face. "But your father chose a bride for you. The king will blame me if I come between his plans for the throne." But DikA shook his head, smiling gently. "No, Dina. My father has already acknowledged you. He knows you saved my life, and everyone in the kingdom knows that I have chosen my own bride. You don't need to worry." Her face softened, but she still looked uncertain. "I didn't want to cause any trouble, that's why I stayed away from the palace. I'm only hearing now that Ola was punished." DikA nodded, understanding her caution. "Dina, if you'd been at the palace, you would have seen for yourself that Ola's punishment had nothing to do with you. Her actions were her own doing. You did nothing wrong, and everyone in Mellow now knows that you are my true choice." Dina's eyes filled with relief, and she reached out to take his hand, gripping it tightly as if she feared he might vanish. She could hardly believe it was really happening, that she could belong with him. Hand in hand, DikA and Dina made their way to the palace, where DikA introduced her formally to his father. When the king saw them enter together, he rose from his throne, his eyes warm with approval. It was clear he had been waiting for this moment. The king smiled at Dina, who knelt beside DikA, her head lowered in respect. "Dina," he said gently, "you saved the life of the prince, the future king of this land, who will soon be your husband. For that, you deserve far more than our gratitude." The king's voice rang out, filling the hall with an authority that commanded attention. "I decree that, from this day forward, all slaves in the kingdom shall be free. You have proven that loyalty and courage exist in all people, regardless of title." Dina's eyes filled with tears of joy as she lowered herself at the king's feet, overcome with gratitude. "Thank you, my king," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The king placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, lifting her up. "Stand tall, Dina. You are to be the future queen of Mellow, and it's time the people see your strength." The entire kingdom soon heard of the king's decree, and joy spread through the village and beyond. DikA and Dina's story became an inspiration, a tale of true love and courage that broke the barriers of tradition. People whispered of how the prince had defied expectations to follow his heart, and how Dina, a slave girl, had proven her worth through her compassion and bravery. Months passed, and DikA and Dina were happily married, settling into their life together in the palace. Dina quickly became beloved by the people for her kindness and strength, and they began to regard her as a true leader. When news of her pregnancy spread, there was great excitement throughout Mellow. The people knew that the future of the kingdom was secure, and they eagerly awaited the birth of the royal child. Dina, now the radiant princess of Mellow, found herself cherished and respected, her past as a slave girl forgotten. DikA, thrilled to be a husband and soon-to-be father, hardly left her side, fussing over her with every step she took. The people watched with joy as their prince doted on his wife, following her wherever she went, his face alight with excitement. In the peaceful kingdom of Mellow, joy and celebration filled the air. With each passing day, the people came together in unity, and the memory of hardships faded. They prayed for Dina's safe delivery, eagerly looking forward to the day they would meet the royal child. Under the wise and compassionate rule of DikA and Dina, the kingdom entered a new era, one where love and justice reigned, and where every soul, free or freed, was valued and respected. And so, the kingdom of Mellow flourished, guided by a love that had conquered all, bringing light, hope, and prosperity to everyone who called it home. If you enjoyed this story and would love to see more heartwarming tales, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support encourages us to keep creating more stories that inspire and entertain. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we look forward to sharing more with you soon.